Okay, well, as I mentioned, it's always terrific to hear these perspectives, and you'll be hearing more. Now, though, we want to turn to our keynote speaker. This should be fascinating, and we'll have an opportunity, and you'll have an opportunity to question him afterwards. Jayson Lusk, who heads the Agricultural Economics Department at Purdue. He studies what we eat and why we eat it. I'm anxious to hear about that. And he's published hundreds of articles on these topics. He's been listed as one of the most prolific and cited food and agricultural economists of the past 2 decades. Won numerous research awards, and he's given hundreds of lectures around the country and around the world on the topics of these industries. Now, with the 2018 Farm Bill on the horizon, he'll also discuss some of the short and long-term views of challenges that are facing agriculture, some of the politics of agriculture, presumably, as well as his thoughts on communicating some of the conversation we were having earlier here about and to modern food consumers, how to bridge these gaps of trust that we were talking about. So please welcome to the stage our keynote speaker, Jayson Lusk. Welcome, it's great.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I was kind of debating what to talk about, this sort of broad title they gave me initially about the Farm Bill. I thought, well, I could show you a bunch of slides of commodity prices, and that might be depressing in more ways than one. Or I could talk to you about sort of the minutia of farm policy, and I thought, well, I don't know that that would be all that exciting either, right after you had a big lunch and you have a break coming up. But what I did think would be useful is if I took a little bit of a step back and tried to look at some broader forces affecting some of the discussions that might affect food and farm policy in the future. And in particular, you noticed the last Farm Bill debate drug on a little longer than usual. A couple of years passed when we expected it to pass. May happen again this time around. We don't know yet. It's probably a little too early. But one of the reasons that debate drug out like it did is that there are many more people sitting at that table than there were before. Many more interest groups. And I think if I had any advice for the producers, at least in this room, is when you think about advocating for various farm policies, think about things that don't just divide up the pie, but expand the size of the pie for everybody. And I think one of the challenges is there are many more people sitting at the table. It's just not farm commodity organizations anymore. It's anti-hunger groups, it's anti-obesity groups, you got environmental groups, you have international development groups, you have animal advocacy organizations, and a whole host of others sitting there, all wanting some piece of the pie. And so it's no wonder we're having a hard time agreeing on what kind of policy we should pass, which is just another way of saying we need to understand better what the interests are and how we might be able to better communicate with some folks. So I thought I'd start by showing you this advertisement here. It's an ad most of you, I'm sure, have seen. It's encouraging you to head on out to Nevada. It says, "What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas." Now, I'm sure none of you are going to do anything here in Anaheim that you wish are going to stay in Anaheim, especially not with Disneyland this close by. But nonetheless, I think there is an element of truth in this ad about agriculture, at least historically speaking. So if you go back 20, 30, 40 years ago, what happened on the farm, by and large, stayed on the farm. Farmers didn't have to think too much about that final food consumer. And consumers, by and large, unless there was a food safety scare or prices got too high, by and large, consumers didn't think about too much of what happened on the farm. But if you haven't noticed, those days are over. There's this emerging food movement that's been with us for a while now that's caused a renewed interest in food and agriculture. And there's a lot of positive things we can say about this food movement. It's encouraged people to use the power of their wallets and sometimes even the power of their own backyards to get the things they want out of the food system. But there's also an element of this food movement that I want to talk about here too that I think is a little more disconcerting, and it relates to the sort of interests related to ag science and technology. So back to this Farm Bill discussion, what are the things that can expand the size of the pie? Innovation, research, being able to get more with less. That expands the size of the pie, not just for producers, not just for food businesses, but for food consumers as well. And I think there's an element of this food movement that has sort of shaped the way a lot of consumers think about food science and technology that I think we need to understand better and figure out how we can address, hopefully in a more constructive way. So this movement is a diverse set of folks. It consists of a whole set of journalists that have written best-selling books and authors. We've got even our former First Lady planted a White House garden. And I think that's just a signal of the kind of growing power of this food movement. You also have folks like the New York Times, hosting conferences called Food for Tomorrow. They had a conference last year, a couple years ago, on farm and food policy. I was a little frustrated to see that there were no ag economists in the room, but that's maybe our fault. But the point is, people are talking about this, and we're not there. And it's also a movement we see emerging in a whole set of new NGOs and a whole bunch of new labels that we'll talk about for a minute. But by and large, this is a movement that is very critical of modern production agriculture. And if you pick up one of these books or magazines when you head out to the airport on the way home, the prevailing view is largely this one that I have up there. It's a view that's critical of our food consumption. That we're eating too much sugar, too much meat, too many processed foods, too many pesticides, we're too fat, we're spending too much on healthcare. This is an image I took out of Time magazine from a few years ago. It's Ronald McDonald. He's eating everything he wants to, but he just can't quite keep up. And it's a view not just about consumers, but about agriculture itself. The agriculture itself has become too corporate, too monoculture, too subsidized, and ultimately at the end of the day, it's unsustainable. And the view you get is one out of this screenshot I took from one of those Chipotle commercials that's been viewed several million times on YouTube. It's a view of agriculture that's just sort of a soulless, lifeless machine. No people there, nobody who cares, just animals being pumped out. And interestingly, and I'll return to this in a minute, it's a view that sort of, in some ways, preys on this idea that people really don't know that much about food and ag, particularly about food and ag technologies. And so those books I have up there, if you pull out some words from the subtitles of all those books, they're here. They talk about a hidden battle or a dark side. Somebody took over something, or there are hidden toxins. There is a secret takeover. So they're really preying on this idea that you don't know that much about that food system, and we have something to tell you. Now, it's kind of amazing to me we've had so many best-selling books when there's so much that's hidden, but I suppose that's a topic for a different time. So if this sort of movement is critical of our current production system, what's the alternative system that's advocated instead? And by and large, it's a kind of romantic traditionalism, a kind of return to nature. And again, these are a couple of images out of a couple of different Chipotle commercials about the alternative vision of agriculture that's held up as an ideal. And it manifests itself often in sort of more calls for local, organic, slow, natural, unprocessed, clean food. And there's nothing wrong with those kinds of foods. And in fact, there's a lot positive we can say about some of them. But I think the real challenge is that many people are not willing or able to pay what it costs to produce food that way. So I think what ends up happening in this discussion is there's a lot of calls for these alternative food systems. We see the market shares for these kind of products, while growing, still remains quite small. Certainly less than 10% of the market. So there's this frustration that emerges. People aren't eating the way that I'm telling them they should. And so what happens is, and there's a whole calls for a whole host of policies, new taxes, new subsidies, all kinds of regulation. And at the end of the day, a lot of social pressure, like somehow maybe you're a bad person if you're not eating the local organic asparagus. But the viewpoint here and the sort of philosophical underpinning here is that we should get ourselves somehow back to this 1940s era agriculture. Smaller farms, less involvement of agribusinesses, fewer off-farm inputs, that somehow this was an ideal type of system that we should get ourselves back to. So I thought I'd show you a picture of actual 1940s agriculture. This is my dad and his siblings on their farm in Silverton, Texas, sometime in the late 40s. Does that look like the Chipotle commercials to you? I don't know. There is a scrawny cow out in the background, probably not well fed. The frank reality is they weren't using very sustainable farming practices. I know that because we don't have that farm anymore. And when new technologies did come along, they rapidly embraced them because it let them live a little more like the people in town did, let them go on vacations occasionally. And so folks that were in these conditions rapidly embraced technologies when they had the opportunity, and in their cases often left the farm when they had the opportunity. But there's a tendency to look back on these pictures and say, boy, those were the good old days, right? But it's kind of hard if you scroll down a little bit. What you probably see is they weren't wearing any shoes. And if my dad's story is correct, they also didn't have any running water or electricity either. The frank reality is that farming was not an ideal situation in the 1940s or 50s. And sure, we have a lot of problems today. We have a lot of new problems we need to address, but we're certainly in a lot better position than we were then. But so I think what we want to think about then is really this idea of sort of lower productivity forms of agriculture relative to more science, innovative-based agriculture. What's the trade-off there? It doesn't have to be either or, but what is the trade-off if we kind of think about food and farm policies that push us in a direction where we're going to use lower productivity forms of agriculture? And there's a couple of ways to think about this. On this slide, each dot here is a country. And on the vertical axis, the x-axis, if you will, this is a measure of the productivity of agriculture in a country. That's the amount of value of agricultural output produced per worker. So the U.S. will be far on the right-hand side of that scale for you. On the other axis is essentially a measure of how well people in your country are fed. So the higher you are, the better fed the people in your country are. So what you see is a pretty strong relationship there. If you happen to live in a country where your agriculture is very productive, good chance you're pretty well fed. Now, there's a lot of, strong correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, but I think there is some causation at the end of that. Now, how does this relate to my argument here? Well, my argument is if we're going to accept lower productivity forms of agriculture, the trade-off there probably is accepting a little higher rate of food insecurity, a little more hunger. And this is particularly true when you get very far in the very low productivity forms of agriculture. These are largely developing countries where the trade-off is pretty severe. And I think one of the concerns, and this will be a bit of a theme here in this presentation, is often what we have are people or countries that are fairly well fed, very productive, constructing a set of policies or ways of thinking about food and agriculture that are affecting folks on the bottom end of that spectrum, where this trade-off is really quite severe and can have very severe consequences for the people in those countries. It's sometimes a little hard to think about in real-world terms what ag productivity means, like what it does in terms of saving resources. So I thought I would try to think of a little bit of a thought experiment to convey this in maybe a way that people could hit home a little better. This is a graph from a New York Times article I had a couple of years ago in trying to illustrate the benefits of increased productivity. And the thought experiment goes like this. Let's imagine we wanted to consume, let's say, the same amount of corn that we in this country actually consumed this year, but we wanted to do that using 1950s technology. And by 1950 technology, I mean yield. So same amount of corn we actually did consume, but we had to do it using 1950s technology. How much more land would we need to do that? And you can see up there, it's about 228 million more acres, basically about 3 times more cropland if we wanted to enjoy the amount of corn that we actually got, but instead we're using the yields of 1950s. For soybeans, you need almost about double the amount of acres to enjoy the same amount of soybeans. About the same for wheat. We need double the wheat acreage. I don't know how much. We need like another United States sitting out beside the one we have now. And so what does this mean? And you see the animal agriculture numbers up above. It means that what this agricultural productivity did is it means we didn't need to use all that land. We didn't need to use all that labor, all the pesticides, all the fertilizer, all the things that would have been required to produce that because we are so much more productive today. Productive because we're using better technology, and also productive because we have better knowledge. We've learned how to do things better. We can apply that knowledge with new technologies and get more using less. That basically, to me, is the definition of sustainability. So despite those gains, I think one thing that's interesting is when we poll consumers, and this is something I do on a routine basis in my day job, is ask people questions about what they think about ag and food technologies. This is one I asked a couple of years ago, and I asked these consumers on a survey, what do you think is the biggest problem facing food and agriculture? And they could give me any answer they wanted to. And then I followed it up with this question. I said, okay, whatever answer you gave me, what do you think is the most effective way of solving that problem? And I forced people into one of 2 options. Either you can adopt a more technological agricultural system, more innovation, more science, more research, or you can adopt this more natural system, more local, more organic, more unprocessed. And you can see the results here. Now, as somebody who considers himself a food and agricultural scientist, this was perhaps one of the most depressing results I think I've ever created. So I think it means there's a long way to go in having these conversations. In talking to people in a constructive way about the benefits of food and ag technologies. So how can we do that, and maybe what are some of the challenges that we will face in addressing in communicating a constructive way about food and ag technologies. And I've got 3 of them I'm going to talk to you about. So I'm going to talk about those 3, and then I'm going to give you about 5 other things I want you just to be on the lookout for, things that could really affect both food policy and food markets going forward. So the first one here, and this isn't a surprise to anyone in this room, but there's this growing divergence between the eaters and the growers in the world. And so if you look just, for example, in the United States, you go back to the 1940s or before, we had between 6 and 7 million farms in this country. Today we have about 2 million. Of course, all the while, population's been growing, and so if you look at, for example, the number of farms per person, it's dramatically declined over time. And it's worse than even that, so, or worse or better, depending on your perspective. So the USDA today tells us there's about 2 million farms in this country. But you get counted as a farm if you have $1,000 in sales. Actually, you don't even have to sell $1,000, you just have to have the potential to sell $1,000. So in other words, if a cow walked across your land, you're a farm. If we actually look at the farms who are producing, any volume of food, it's pretty incredible. Only about 7.5% of all farms produce 80% of the value of ag output. This was in 2012, the last time we had an ag census. So to put that in actual numbers terms, that's about 159,000 farms producing 80% of the value of ag output. That's really incredible. And it also tells you a little bit of the communication challenge. You go back to the 1950s, if you saw something on whatever was the equivalent of 1950s Twitter about, some controversial technology, you could go, ask your mom or dad. You maybe have an aunt and uncle, or you had a cousin. You knew somebody that probably worked on a farm. So there was some way to ground truth the things you heard and the kind of concerns you had. But what are the chances you think most, we've got roughly 330 million people in this country. What do you think the chances are they know one of these 159,000 people? Probably next to 0. So I think this presents a real challenge about, understanding a kind and a way of life that you don't have any connection to. So this, I suspect, is somewhat old news, but what I want to do is say, what are some of the implications of this trend that perhaps you haven't thought of? So here's one. This is a map of California that's conveying the results of a vote that was held in the state a few years ago. And what I've shaded in are different counties according to how they voted on this particular state proposition. And what you can see here is that there's a bit of an urban-rural divide in terms of how Californians voted on this proposition. You got the coastal areas, and you got the Central Valley that, more ag-related, that voted in a particular way. And you got the area over next to Lake Tahoe. My question for you is, what ballot initiative was this? So I hear, yeah, GMO, maybe Prop 2. Actually, this is the Prop 8 on same-sex marriage. And so I've got the same graph that you have here, but right next to it I have the Prop 37 on mandatory GMO labeling. And I've done the same shading in there. It's not 1-to-1, but it's pretty darn close, isn't it? If your county voted to essentially ban same-sex marriage, very good chance your county voted against mandatory labeling for GMOs. The relationship is even stronger than this graph reveals. If I take each county and look at the percentage of people in that county that voted in favor of each one of these, I put that on this graph, it's pretty darn close to 1-to-1. In fact, if I take the way a particular county in California voted in 2008 on same-sex marriage, I can predict with over 70% accuracy how that same county would have voted on mandatory labeling of GMOs in 2012. Now, you must be thinking to yourself, Jason, what does same-sex marriage have to do with GMO labeling? And my answer to you is that's exactly the point. Do you think the vote on mandatory GMO labeling really had anything to do with the science of GMOs? When you see this strong of a correlation, it suggests to me no. There may be a little bit on the margin, but by and large, probably not. It suggests to me there's something going on underlying both of these that's driving votes in both directions. And I would suggest that it's maybe sort of just a difference in urban versus rural values. And it's a whole set of issues. Maybe it's political party, maybe it's your tribal loyalty or team loyalty. But often we don't consider the actual merits of the debate. We look at what our team members around us are doing and say, I'll go with them. And so I think that's one of the challenges we have here, is that this disconnect we have in the sort of demographics, if you will, of how the farming population has changed over time has a big consequence for how we even talk about these issues and how we sort of communicate with them. I think another big challenge would be, you've heard a lot probably in the news about economic inequality. Well, that has implications too for our food eating as well. These things manifest themselves in eating patterns. And what we'll see here, I think, is that the preferences of people who are fairly well-to-do can be quite different than folks that are lower on the socioeconomic spectrum. This matters, I think, because if you're higher income, younger, chances are you're more likely to be influencing what we read in the news. Chances are you're more likely to be able to influence political outcomes. So what you tend to read about, what the things that we tend to see enacted in policy are going to represent the preferences of a particular set of people that may not be particularly reflective of the population at large. And I think to the extent we see this, inequality grow, I think that will continue to be a challenge. The first way we can see this is worldwide. This is probably one of the more famous kinds of relationships that economists have recognized for over 100 years. It's called the Engel curve. And although this is more recent data, it's basically a relationship between income and the percentage of income that you spend on food. Again, each dot there is a country. On the vertical axis is a measure of per capita income in that country. Then on the y-axis is a percentage of the income in that country that's spent on food. And you can see it's an inverse relationship. The richer you are, in general, the lower the percentage of your income that you spend on food. So you can see sort of where the U.S. is over here. We're spending less than 10% of our income on food. And then you still though have a lot of countries over here spending 40, 50, 60% of their income on food. And they also tend to be very poor in many cases. So I think, the challenge though, I think in many cases, when we look at some of these technological acceptance, we heard earlier that, let's not even try to get GMOs approved in Europe anymore because of the regulatory process. Those decisions in Europe have a lot of impact on what these countries will do too, because they want to import into Europe as well. So we've got relatively rich folks where we could care about a lot of other things, often sort of constructing the narrative and environment that's affecting a lot of other people in the world who are spending a lot more on food. I think I'll skip this slide for time. This is a relationship we can also see within the United States. So this is data, again, from some of the surveys I have routinely conducted. And you can see inside the United States, this is food away from home, at home, and then total. If you're making over $140,000 or above, you're spending less than 10% of your income on food. But if you're down here on the lower end, $20,000, $30,000 a year, you might be spending 30, 40% of your income on food. So even within the United States, you see this kind of phenomenon play out. And so how do the preferences of these people on the two different spectrums matter? I mean, one is obviously they're spending more different volumes of their income on food, but they differ in other ways as well. One, for example, would be using those same data I just showed you, what percentage of your food budget do you spend away from home? This isn't terribly surprising, but the wealthier your household is, the more you spend eating out. Makes perfect sense, right? If I can afford to get somebody to cook and clean up after me, I'm going to do it, right? So it just tells you that as your income grows, you tend to want things that are different than when your income was lower. But we can see this manifested in other ways, and this is some other data here. So I've been doing a monthly survey of U.S. food consumers for over 5 years now, and this is a question I've included every month on that survey. And so each one of those dots there probably has more than 50,000 observations. And what we ask in this question is, here's a set of about 12 or 13 what I call food values. And we just ask people, which of these is most and least important to you when you buy food? So we ask it this way because, if we just ask, is this important to you? People would probably say, well, all these things are important to me. So we're forcing a bit of a trade-off here. And then what you can see, then we calculate something of a ranking. And so you can see the things that people say are most important to them: taste, safety, nutrition, and price. That's not terribly surprising, but those are often not the things in the news, are they? Often what we hear about are the things in the middle, whether it's naturalness or animal welfare, convenience or environment. Again, I'm not saying those things aren't important to people, but at least in terms of relative ranking, less important than these sort of big four: taste, safety, nutrition, and price. And again, this data is very stable over time. I'll show you a graph on that in just a sec. But the maybe other questions to say, how does this differ across different income categories? So here are the things where as you get more income, you care more about when you buy food. So I call these the food values of the rich. So as your income grows, you tend to think it's more important that your food is natural, your nutrition is more important, origin is more important, novelty and environment are also more important. What about the opposite? As your income grows, these issues become less important. Or the other way to say it is they're more important to lower income households. The big one there, of course, is price. I had that screenshot, I put it out on Twitter, and I said, poor people care more about price than rich people. And I got a bunch of responses that were like, well, duh. So it's, it seems obvious, right? But one thing that might be a little hard to tell, I don't want to spend the time to do it here, but the magnitude of the change there is very large. It's not just that the poor care more about price, they care a lot more about prices than higher income consumers. And so when we think about these sort of alternative versions of agriculture that increase the price of food, for those folks that have a little higher income, it's just not that big a deal if it tends to increase the price. But it does really matter quite a lot more to folks that are sort of on the lower economic spectrum. And again, my argument is that these folks here, most of us, probably a lot of us here in this room, have the ability to influence food discussions. We have the ability to influence the politics surrounding food, much more so than folks that are probably down on this end. You might ask, well, these things, how are they changing over time? Are people becoming more or less concerned about these things? Here's those big four: taste, safety, nutrition, and price over this roughly 5-year time period. A lot of squiggles in there, but basically, it's stayed fairly constant over time. If anything, maybe price has gotten a little more important over the last year, but not huge changes. If there's been any trend at all, it's probably been in these two, animal welfare and naturalness. If anything, have probably increased a little over time, but not a lot. It's a lot of noise in the data there. So in other words, over this time period, people have remained fairly steady in terms of their food preferences, although with a little bit of growth in importance on animal welfare and naturalness. Okay, last kind of trend about communication, and then I'll move on to the last topic. But the other issue, this has kind of came up in our one of the initial discussions here. I think Frank mentioned it early on about this growing population. And I think one thing that makes this challenging in terms of talking about to the average food consumer is that the population trends aren't the same everywhere. And so what I want to ask you is sort of the kinds of communication that we use within this group is the kind of stuff that's on this board. Like, we need to feed the 9 billion, or we need to produce 70% more food for the 9.7 billion that are going to show up by 2050. And as a result, we need to be an AgVocate, right? So my question to you is not whether this is true. It is. We will need to produce more food for a growing population. My question to you is whether this is convincing to somebody outside this room. One of those hundreds of cheerleaders I had to ride the elevator with earlier today. If you went to one of them and said, we need to produce 70% more food by 2050 because there's going to be another billion people show up, do you think does that convince you that I should be able to use biotechnology or soil biologics or fly drones over my field? I mean, I don't know for sure, but my guess is it probably doesn't have much influence on, wouldn't be very compelling for them. And so, in fact, we can see this even in sort of some of our more elite media outlets. So, for example, here's Mark Bittman in the New York Times. He says, don't even ask how to feed the 9 billion. The solution isn't to produce more food, it's to eliminate poverty. Well, I might agree with him on that. I think the problem is if you knew how to eliminate poverty, just come talk to me afterwards. We don't know the answer to that problem either. But we do produce a lot of food. We have some problems with distribution too, and I think we do need to grow to meet our growing population, but you see a lot of pushback. Also, there's movements like this reducitarian movement telling people if this rhetoric is true, then what we should do is cut back now, those of us in the rich world. And I think there's probably an element of truth to that. If I was involved in production agriculture, though, I'd be a little worried about telling people you should cut back on the thing that I'm producing, right? It's probably not good for your bottom line. And so I think one of the challenges that makes this, one of the issues that makes this discussion challenging is that the population projections depend very much on where you're at. And so this is data from the United Nations. It's the population in the past. The vertical line there is roughly today, and the data after that is projections about where population is going. And I've split the countries into 3 categories, basically rich, middle income, or low income countries. So the relatively rich countries, that's us, Western Europe down here on the bottom. Basically, the UN is projecting our population is going to be flat, if not falling. In fact, you can already see it in Western Europe that in fact, almost all the population growth in Western Europe is coming from immigration, not from new childbirths there. Even in middle-income countries, growing, but not by very much. And so virtually all of that population growth that's being projected is coming from low-income countries. So I think that gets back to this argument of, is this kind of argument about we need to feed the world compelling? Well, most U.S. consumers, they walk outside their hotel room, they're probably too well-fed in a lot of cases. They're looking around, population doesn't look too out of control to them, because all that problem is somewhere else. And so what I think that we need, the message here is that if we want to think about the value of ag and science technologies, we need to think about talking about it in a way that hits home to people that live here. Not to say we certainly care about these people, but if we're just talking about the tactic of communication, we need to think about what's compelling. So what are some implications of these three kind of trends that I think are some challenges for communication? One is, and this gets to the policy issue, that I think as we go forward in the future, that policy is going to be more about food and less about farm. And again, I think you can see that sort of in the debate that happened with the last farm bill, and I think we'll see it going forward. In fact, if you look at our farm bill right now, it's, the spending on it is roughly 80% for food assistance programs. So it already, in some ways, is a food bill, but I think what you'll see over time are further calls to use that policy to enact a set of policy changes on the behalf of the food consumer, not on behalf of agricultural producers. And you've already seen some pretty prominent authors, like this piece in the Washington Post from a couple of years ago, basically advocating for just that. Let's get rid of the USDA and create instead a food department, or a food bureau instead of the USDA. And I would also say, this is more than just, conveying the science or getting your message out. It depends on what you're communicating. So I talked about this potential gap between urban and rural values. Whatever your values happen to be, you've got to put yourself in the shoes of somebody else and say what's important to them. And how can I communicate in a way that talks on the level of the person I'm trying to communicate with? And sometimes it might be very different than what we care about here in this room. When I looked at those income trends, I think, what we have to do is pay attention to the things that people care about, particularly people that can influence the media. So those are going to be quote unquote quality issues, nutrition, naturalness, environment. And so my question is, I think we heard a little bit of that earlier today, but what are the innovations that address those challenges? What is it about, CRISPR-Cas9 that is going to help save the environment, that is going to make my health better? That's the kind of, talking about the benefits of the communication to those consumers on their terms is really going to be much more constructive. And again, I think, certainly I think it is true that we need to increase agricultural productivity, but I think it's going to be hard for people in relatively rich countries to feel the urgency of that kind of conversation. In other words, I think this is a message we tell ourselves as insiders to agriculture to get ourselves, pumped up and motivated, like let's do more, because this is something we do and it really does matter. But what you have to do is separate out that in your mind and say, I can motivate myself with that message, but I also have to have a message for people outside this room that they might find compelling. And I'm going to challenge you a little bit on this here. I might bite the hand that fed me a little bit here. But just think about the word AgVocate. We're in ag, so that sounds good to us. But to what extent does somebody, one of those cheerleaders, again, outside this room, if they hear that word, what do they think? They might think, oh, that's just another interest group. They're having a lobbying meeting down the road about how to get more, farm subsidies. I mean, I don't know, but that's what I would worry about. What if instead you said, actually, what we're trying to do here is advocate on behalf of the food consumer? And if I think about what I'm trying to do in a lot of my, writing and research is do just that. And think about really what are the things you're doing on the farm. Why would you adopt a new technology? Well, it might save you time or labor, but ultimately at the end of the day, it has some benefit for the food consumer. One that's probably hard for them to understand, doesn't translate very well, is it makes the price of that food lower. But, saving resources definitely has a strong message that relates to environmental sustainability too. So I think, articulating that productivity growth is more than just about saving the world or food prices. It's also a whole set of other things that you care about too, about saving the environment for our planet and the kids for tomorrow. And so, think about the sort of out-group message in addition to in-group message as well. And just so I don't gloss over it there too, somehow in our discussions about sustainability and sustainability sort of writ large, productivity has sort of been divorced from that somehow. So if I had any plea here, it's that really, in my opinion, productivity growth is really the corner of improvement and sustainability. And so recoupling those two and making sure that any discussions, whether it's with food companies or whatever else, about what does it mean to measure sustainability, that surely productivity growth needs to be at least a part of that discussion. And somehow it sort of seems to have been left off on the side. So again, how does one communicate about these food and ag technologies in a way that can increase ag productivity for you, but also is acceptable to consumers? And I think I've already sort of shared with you some of those. And this newer book I have that came out last year, I try to tell some of those stories. Each of the chapters here is basically a food and ag innovation, but trying to tell about those innovations through the lens of the person doing the innovating and why they're doing it and solving the problems that they see there. And there's chapters in here about precision ag technology, and you're right, it's not new technology. It's certainly not new to you all in this room, but it almost certainly is new to those cheerleaders in the hallway. They probably have no idea of the drones that are being used in this kind of sensing technologies, and the fact that we're trying to be more judicious with fertilizer applications so that we can help try to reduce runoffs in our waterways. And so there's a whole set of these, but again, trying to talk about the benefits of science and technology in a way that sort of hits home with the food consumer and the benefits to them. But I thought I'd wrap up here by maybe shifting gears for just a second and say, what are some other big things to keep your eye out for? What are things that could be affecting the food and ag policy debates and discussions of the future? And I thought I'd pick on 5 of them here. Of course, one of them I just spent the most time talking about here, sort of this food movement and sort of the cultural thinking about ag science and technology. So these are sort of some additional things that I'll just touch on very briefly before I wrap up. The first one here is, this is not really something to keep an eye on other than just to say there seems to me to be a lot of volatility out there in sort of the public discussions. And one way you can see this is, for lack of a better phrase for it, there are just a lot of troubled marriages out there that are sort of signaling the fact that the sort of traditional coalitions perhaps that have been around might be fraying at the edges. So one of these, for example, is the Grocery Manufacturers Association. Arguably, at least in the past, one of the most prominent, powerful food lobbyists in DC. And what you've seen there is a splintering of that group. First, Campbell's Soup said they were no longer going to be a part. Then you had organizations like Nestle and Mars and others. And I don't have any inside information as to what's going to happen to that organization, but its future at this present moment seems highly uncertain. We saw at least a lot of Twitter battles about debates between grain buyers, whether it's Cargill, for example, partnering with the Non-GMO Verified Project, and a bunch of farmers getting upset with them. Like, I thought you were telling us we should be talking about the benefits of this technology, and here you are advocating a labeling policy which is sort of casting some fear on this kind of technology. And so you had all this sort of battle back and forth, like, I'm not going to sell to you if you're going to get in bed with the folks that I don't agree with sort of philosophically. Also, you saw this, so the first two and really this third are all really related to the GMO labeling debate. But even within the organic community, you had a lot of sort of discussion and debate and turmoil. For example, last summer we passed this national mandatory labeling policy that really didn't seem to please either side of this debate. But one of the things that it causes a little bit of fracturing within organic, because I think what organic saw is that all of a sudden you could put this label on and capture a lot of the premium that was there at a much lower price. So you saw groups like the Organic Trade Association coming out with these ads that say things like, organic is non-GMO and more. And a lot of, sort of infighting within the organic community. Sometimes we've seen debates even between farmers and input suppliers. And I won't go into a lot of that now, but you've seen debates even in ag commodity organizations, like the beef checkoff, for example. Last year there was a proposal, 2 years ago, I guess, that where our former Secretary of Ag proposed a separate checkoff program for those. And you even see things on the farm policy level, like groups like the Conservative Heritage Foundation taking a very strong stance, putting out some policy reports, very critical of sort of the farm bill proposal, the sort of typical farm bill that we see. This is historically a group that's coming from red state, rural areas that you might think historically has been aligned with some of the farm lobby, and yet there seems to be some disagreement there as well. So I don't know what the implication of this is, other than just to say there's a lot of change going on right now. And you should probably keep your eyes on that change, because what we may see emerge out of this are new sets of coalitions that perhaps we didn't necessarily expect. And that's maybe one of the messages of communication too, is trying to figure out who is it that we share some common principles. Maybe we weren't allies before, but we might be on a new set of issues. Another big issue, I think, to watch out is what's going to happen over the next 10, 20 years with regard to meat demand. Now, realize we have probably a lot of crop producers in the room, but if you take corn and soybeans, you care about meat demand because a very large percentage of your production is going to feed animals. We track meat demand on a monthly, quarterly basis, and thus far, actually, meat demand seems very strong at the present moment. If anything, it actually kind of probably is increasing a little bit at the moment. But I think there's some signs under that to suggest there's maybe a little bit of a weak underbelly there to maybe keep an eye out on. One is, in some recent research we did, is we found that over time, price has become a less important driver of meat demand. Other non-price factors seem to be having a bigger impact on whether meat demand is increasing or decreasing. In particular, one of the things we've seen, particularly for beef, is that media stories related to climate change and animal welfare have had a dampening effect on meat demand. So how is it that meat demand overall is rising? Well, because at the same time, there's been an increase in the number of stories on things like, look how good, beef is tasty and it tastes good and it has good flavor. Those kinds of stories have tended to offset these sort of negative consequences of meat demand. But in general, what we find is these concerns about nutrition, animal welfare, environment have a dampening effect on meat demand. And as I mentioned, those are the things that seem to be growing in importance for food consumers. The other thing that we found, which is probably not surprising, but maybe you haven't thought about it before, and that is that there's a pretty strong correlation between political ideology and meat consumption. So if you had to guess, which political ideology is more likely to eat beef? Conservative, yes, boom, all right. So it's not, that part is not terribly surprising, but what we have found is that there's a gap there. Conservatives are more likely to eat meat than liberals, and that gap is growing over time, over the last 5 years. So what that tells me is some of these meat consumption issues are increasingly becoming politicized. And it's not surprising if meat demand is increasingly being linked to these stories on climate change and animal welfare. So that could be something interesting to look at. In terms of demand growth, probably in a country like the United States, we're not likely to see big increases in meat demand. We may see some gains there, but if there's going to be increases in meat demand growth, almost all of it probably is going to be international. Back to that sort of Engel curve, another relationship that seems fairly consistent is that as incomes grow, people tend to add more meat in their diet. And so you think about a country like China, maybe India, although India is historically more vegetarian, but nonetheless, as incomes grow, we expect protein to be added at a much faster rate in those diets until you get to a country like the US, and then at some point you keep increasing the quality of your diet. Maybe you go from hams to pork chops to steaks, and then you go to tofu at some point, when your income grows. Or what you do is you go to some plant-based alternative. And this is the other thing I think you should really keep an eye out on as a potentially very disruptive technology. And I know this sounds kind of pie in the sky. I have a chapter on this in that Unnaturally Delicious book, but the sort of plant-based or cellular-based meat alternatives. So the Impossible Burger, I was surprised in Indianapolis just last week. I went in a restaurant, it was sitting there on the menu. So my 15-year-old son ordered the Impossible Burger, I ordered the regular beef burger, and we did a taste test. I'm not a big fan of the typical vegetarian patty, but this was pretty darn good. And this is produced, it tastes a lot more similar because it's using a process that is producing animal-like proteins. It's a fermentation process where yeast are genetically engineered to produce proteins that are sort of animal-like, and they turn them into a burger like this. One of the interesting things that's maybe a bit ironic is, for all the concerns about biotechnology, are the people going to be accepting of this burger? I don't know. If the story is that this burger is going to save the planet, that might appeal to the same people that normally we would think about as being hostile to GMOs. By the way, I've done lots of research on GMOs. By and large, the baseline message there is most people just know next to nothing about the technology. So can people change their minds? You bet they can. Of course, there's some cell-based alternatives here too. This is a stem cell kind of product. So take a stem cell out of a cow, you put it in a proverbial petri dish. What does a stem cell do? It reproduces itself. Lots of stem cells from a muscle reproducing in a petri dish get together. You've got a bunch of meat cells and you've got a muscle. If you've got a muscle, you've got meat. And so this is real life meat. You can even do crazy things like you could create a rhinoceros burger if you wanted, if you took a stem cell from a rhinoceros or something. I don't know why you'd want that, but you could do it. This is scientifically feasible now. It's still costly. So back 2 or 3 years ago, I think they could produce a burger for $100,000. So it's not likely to hit the market. But this is the kind of thing people are working on. And I think, like these Impossible Burgers, they're in the market now. And I think we heard some discussion earlier about venture capital money flowing in. There is a lot of investment money flowing into this space right now. And some of that investment dollars are coming from within agriculture. So Tyson, Cargill buying into a lot of these startups. So it seems kind of pie in the sky, but this is a potentially very disruptive technology. So you think about if, let's see, I can't off the top of my head think about what percentage of the corn crop goes into animal feed, but let's say it's 50%. That's a big deal, right? What happens to all that corn? I mean, you've got to feed these microbes something, but probably not that much. What happens to sort of all the traditional arrangements that we've sort of had in animal agriculture? It's a bit difficult to think about what kind of disruptive force that might be. So a couple other issues, and then I'll stop. One is you've probably heard of trade in the news, and whether it's TPP or NAFTA, and this is not always directly a part of our farm bill, but this is certainly something to watch out if you're in agriculture. So these data are a couple of years old, but it depends on your crop. But there's certainly a lot of crops where trade is a very big deal. So for cotton in this country, we're exporting almost 80% of the cotton to other countries. Almond, pecans, wheat is about half of our crops. Soybeans about half as well, probably a little higher than that. Now, so trade is a big deal. If you look at all of agriculture in the U.S., agriculture is a net exporter. So trade is a big deal for agriculture. And if you look at who is our biggest trading partner, yeah, it's Japan and Asia, but it's also the other big ones typically are Canada and Mexico, so our NAFTA partners. So to the extent some change happens in our trading relationship there, that can have a very significant financial consequence for a lot of U.S. agriculture. Two last things. One is, despite all of my research on, asking consumers what they would do and when they would do it, or looking at scanner data, the frank reality is that a lot of the action in terms of big changes has come not from individual consumers choosing certain things, but by retailers or food manufacturers choosing to make certain pledges. So it's this interaction between advocacy organizations and those food retailers that are really having big influences on what's offered in that retail space. So understanding that sort of political dynamic, if you will, I think is increasingly important. That's where a lot of the action is. So just to give you one example, most of the U.S. Food retailers have pledged to go cage-free in egg production by 2025. So if that happens, we would need to convert more than 75% of our layer flock between now and 2025 to go cage-free. That's a pretty dramatic change for an industry, and not a costless one either. And so one sort of implication of that is there's a lot of discussion about what sustainability means in these companies, and I think being a part of that conversation has got to be more than just the advocacy organizations, the environmental, animal, but ag advocacy organizations being a part of those discussions. Needs to be important too. And you might wonder why would these food companies do this? And the answer is that they have billion-dollar brands on the line, and they're protecting that brand equity that built up over time. And if it's to prevent a protest or bad publicity, sometimes they're willing to make some concessions to do that. But those concessions have implications all throughout the whole supply chain. And that's my last point here, is that I think there's a lot of changes in supply chain issues that we may see that are going to trickle back down to the farm. So, I hope you all sold your Bitcoin, a couple of months ago before prices fell off. So Bitcoin's probably not the disruptive technology for ag, but the technology underlying the trading of Bitcoin might be. And this is the blockchain kind of technology. So this is basically a public ledger that's distributed. Everybody can see it, and it's a log of transactions. It's more than just that. You can also carry along with that log of transactions a whole bunch of information that would have been hard to do otherwise. I think we just saw a couple of weeks ago the first international trade using blockchain of grain between the U.S. and China. This is a quote out of a story from just a week or so ago about Walmart. It said, before the blockchain test, it took Walmart 6 days, 18 hours, and 26 minutes to trace mangoes back to their original source. But now, with this blockchain technology, it took Walmart 2 seconds to do it. Not only that, they were able to carry forward a whole bunch of information, and one of those pieces of information is that one of their trucks was stuck at the border for 4 days. Maybe for mangoes, it's not that big a deal, but if it was fresh meat, I'd sure want to know if it was sitting at the border for 4 days. So this ability to trace and track foods and carry with it a whole host of information, like maybe what pesticides were used in on the farm, might be something that's very disruptive. And all that comes upon, this sort of mergers of the sort of Amazons and Whole Foods of the world that have supply chains and allow for the sort of customization that we heard earlier that maybe millennials are interested in, could have a very big impact on the supply chain, could further increase the consolidation we've seen, but also raise expectations about traceability back down to the farm level. So I appreciate you giving me the chance to talk to you a little bit here today. I hope, I said a lot of things about food and ag technology, but for me it's really exciting to come to groups like this because there's a lot of really interesting things going on the ag productivity and development side. And so I firmly believe that we have a very optimistic future in food and agriculture, and coming to groups and talking to folks like this here makes me even more optimistic. So thanks.
Well, thank you, Jayson. That's really, really interesting, and you've prompted 1,000 different things and questions, and we'll take a few of them here in the minutes that remain. But I just want to point out one thing. While you were talking about all of this, I went on and I looked up, because you talked about nutrition, but you didn't talk about health specifically. And when you went to the meat conversation, so I just Googled correlation between red meat and cancer. Mm-hmm. And this comes up from the Cancer Council. There is now a clear body of evidence that bowel cancer is more common among those who eat the most red and processed meat. Processed meat consumption has been strongly linked to higher risk of stomach cancer, and we know these things are out there. How much does that play in all of this? I mean, it's not just, what you want to eat and that kind of thing. I mean, we're being told, and that's interesting to me, whether that also follows political lines.
It can. So certainly there is a strong correlation between red meat consumption and certain kinds of cancer. In fact, the WHO that made the controversial conclusion about glyphosate and cancer is also the same organization that came out. There's all the big stories about bacon causing cancer back a couple of years when it came out. One thing that's pretty tough is in the nutrition space is separating correlation from causation. So if you look at who are the biggest consumers of red meat, they tend to be correlated with all the other things that make you die early, like being a man, drinking a lot, smoking a lot, and other sorts of activities. So, doing nutrition science well is really, really difficult. And I think right now one of the things we're seeing is there's a lot of debate about, it used to be for 20 or 30 years that fat was essentially vilified and demonized. In the latest nutritional guidelines that came out after almost 30 years, they came out and said, eggs are no longer an ingredient of concern after, all these years of thinking that the cholesterol in eggs was going to kill us. So, the point there is I think that this is a thing that probably undermines part of the consumer trust in science, particularly on the nutrition side, is that one day we hear blueberries are going to cure us, and then chocolate's going to kill us or save us or whatever. And it comes from science that's not very settled, but gets communicated to create headlines. So I think the message for me as a scientist is we should probably be a little more humble sometimes in what we know and be more willing to say, I don't know, or we're not quite sure. It is certainly true, and I think to the extent our incomes grow, consumers are going to care more about health issues. Do we know what the right advice is to tell them? I'm not so sure.
I'm eating a lot of blueberries these days.
Yeah, right.
Should I continue?
There's a strong correlation that would be a good thing for you, but probably not going to have a huge impact.
Okay.
Yeah.